Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
All right, Tristan, welcome back, man. It's been a while. I know you've had a very relaxing and rested, nothing really much going on in the last month or so.
If only that were true. A month ago, we had our diplomatic academy in Cambridge, which went spectacularly well. I'm already very, very excited for the next one next July. And then move to the other side of the world. And so here I am in Hong Kong. It's been a couple of weeks. I think I'm already on my third typhoon now, which is about to make landfall later this afternoon. And I think what's most important to emphasize is that before coming, everybody said the food really is spectacular. And obviously, I'm coming here from the UK, and so it's a low bar, shall we say, to jump over. But Hong Kong lives up to its reputation. I have yet to have a bad meal. Absolutely spectacular.
Well, I'll be able to watch you gain weight, maybe not our listeners, but we'll see. Yeah, it's amazing. And it's 8 p.m. for me, 8 a.m. for you. So I'm getting ready for bed. You're getting ready to start your day. So it'll be an interesting as we work through this time difference. But yeah, my little hiatus was spent a little bit differently. I did some vacation and did some beach time, and we went up to the New England area and visited Boston, where my wife is from and stuff, and the kids got to see it for the first time. While we were there, we we actually stayed with one of my wife's best friends from college, and her mom came to visit. Shout out to Betsy Sullivan, and she is an avid listener of Diplomatic Community. So always like to give a shout out to listeners of the podcast. So Betsy, thanks for listening, and I hope you keep doing so. Moving on, what's on the docket today?
First up, today, tonight, whenever we are, we're going to be talking about El Salvador's latest turn towards authoritarianism and what it could mean for the region more broadly. Then we're going to get into recent deteriorations in the US-India relationship and the Japan-Australia naval deal. And then finally, we'll turn to Dr. Sophal Ear to discuss last month's skirmish between Thailand and Cambodia.
All right, let's get to it.
Okay, well, earlier this month, El Salvador's Legislative Assembly voted to remove presidential term limits from the constitution, which allows President Nayib Bukele to seek re-election indefinitely. He is just 44 years old and now could potentially rule the country for decades. Now, this change comes alongside other moves to consolidate power, including eliminating runoff elections and extending presidential terms from 5 to 6 years. Now, Bukele's popularity stems largely from his successful fight against violent crime. Under him, El Salvador's murder rate has dropped from 51 murders per 100,000 people in 2018 to just 1.9 per 100,000 people in 2024. This is a rate that is lower than Canada's. The number of homicides in the country dropped from several thousand a year to just over 100. It is, in terms of numbers, obviously a success. However,
Astonishing.
yeah, it's astonishing. Yeah, however, in order to achieve this, the president has instituted a rolling state of emergency for over 3 years, which the national legislature has continued to renew. Since the beginning of the state of emergency, this was in March 2022, over 85,000 people have been jailed without trial, and many have been tortured and kept in prisons with unsafe living conditions. So, taking all of this together, how should we understand this move, do you think, Kelly, in the context of democratic backsliding, certainly across Latin America? And what is a signal for the trade-offs between security and democracy that it seems voters are willing to make?
Yeah, I think in one way, we mentioned that there was a huge however there on this fall in crime rates and murder rates. I think people are extremely willing to vote for security. And is something we've seen all over the world, not just
Mm.
in Latin America. Think about just in the United States and politicians campaigning on being tough on crime and things like that. And I live just outside of Washington, D.C., which is now the federal government has sent in the National Guard and taken control of the D.C. police. It's not the same situation as El Salvador. Crime is going down in Washington, D.C. This is more for theatrics than anything else, but, it will appease a lot of people that think there's high crime and things like that. It
Right.
makes them feel more comfortable. When you're in a situation like El Salvador, where there is actually massive amounts of murder and violent crime, it makes sense on one hand why people would allow their leaders to creep towards authoritarianism, creep towards dictatorial powers. And this has a historical track record, right? This isn't something that's just happening for the first time. People have always given away rights in order for more security. And the difficulty is finding that sweet spot where you can create a more secure, a more safe environment without democratic backsliding. And that's not what's happening in El
Yeah.
Salvador. And he's wildly popular. His approval ratings remain over 80%. He won the presidential election with over 84% of the vote. These aren't, as far as we know, like made up numbers, like some dictatorial powers and authoritarian states. So this is legitimate. And what we're hearing from folks and experts is that the people of El Salvador have accepted this tough action on the part of the president in exchange for greater security. And just on a side note, I know a Salvadoran family, and she has kids and grandkids in El Salvador, and she loves Bukele
Fascinating.
because of the fact that he's made it so much safer. Because I brought it up, not in a way of passing judgment in any way, just talking about Bukele and mentioning him, and she was just fawning over him. So it's a real phenomenon. He's also, right from the beginning, has cracked down on a lot of innocent people too. It's largely young men suspected of having gang affiliations that were literally just caught up in violent police raids and jailed without a trial. Now, granted, he's obviously getting some members of crime organizations in these crackdowns, but he's also getting a lot of innocent people, like I said, and that's where the problem stems from. And that has also grown to go towards groups that are outside of violent crime since he's changed a lot of these rules. And it's now including journalists, human rights defenders, and political opponents. They actually just passed a new foreign agents law. And I did foreign agents in air quotes, which, if folks remember, there was a similar law enacted by Vladimir Putin in 2012. And this just suppresses civil society and media outlets that oppose the government. And it's forcing people or organizations that receive any foreign funds to register and pay a 30% tax. And also, they have to go and register so they're known to the government, and it makes what they're doing more difficult. And in recent months, journalists from investigative outlets have fled the country because arrest warrants were issued, and a prominent human rights NGO closed because of threats to their safety. So he's broadening the circle of who he's arresting and who he's going after. And he also did this at the right political moment, right? Because he's got the backing of the legislature. He's hugely popular. So he's solidifying this constitutionally while he has the power to do so and the popularity. And 6 years from now, if people don't like him as much, they can't really do that much about it because he's taken the levers of power in a way that is outside democratic norms and the rule of law, and can get away with things that you couldn't in a true democracy. And he's also a buddy with President Trump. One of the more interesting aspects of this to me, and this speaks to the larger stance on human rights that the US government is now pursuing under the second Trump administration. They just in the last couple of weeks put out a statement that the State Department did that they won't be really commenting on human rights in places anymore. When President Trump visited the Gulf states a couple months ago, he came out and said, we're not going to tell you what to do anymore. But yet, on the other hand, Vice President Vance goes and criticizes the Europeans because they don't agree with what they're doing democratically or anti-democratically So it's a very subjective use of talking about human rights by the administration at this point. And we'll see what happens. Bukele really brought down the violent crime rate, but the economy isn't doing what he had hoped it would do. So, that I think in the longer term, now that he has fixed this crime problem, is going to be the bigger problem for him on whether or not he can live up to those demands. But also, like you mentioned in the opening, this can be a playbook. And we've seen it in some other places already in Latin America where there's been increased violent crime in different countries. And we've seen some of these leaders take this harsh stance on just arresting thousands of people that are of gang age, but it is successful. And that's the dilemma that democracies have to figure out. How do we get tough on crime without taking away the rule of law and people's rights and things like that? So going to have to keep watching this. Isn't something we, obviously democracies haven't figured this out yet. So
yeah. And actually seem further from figuring it out than was the case even just a few years ago.
So moving on, you also mentioned we're going to touch on the growing U.S.-India tensions. So why the relationship is deteriorating between the U.S. and India is because President Trump has slapped a 25% tariff on Indian goods, and that is going to rise by the end of the month to 50%, making it one of the hardest hit countries and marking a further divide between the world's two largest democracies. So we should add that there is a carve out to the tariffs, though, that doesn't touch on pharmaceutical goods, auto parts, and cell phones. These are exempt at this point. But on everything else, we're going to have a 50% tariff starting on August 28th. India claims that it's being unfairly treated by the U.S., calling out American and European trade dealings with Russia in certain cases, because this all stems from the fact that India, despite the sanctions on Russian crude oil, has been buying Russian crude oil since 2022. And it has become one of Russia's biggest customers. And today it imports nearly 2 million barrels a day. And this actually represents 35 to 40% of India's crude imports today. So it's a huge increase from what they were importing from Russia before the war in Ukraine and the sanctions were put on Russia. So on the face of it, this is a very surprising move because Washington has been increasingly viewing New Delhi as a crucial partner in its efforts to counter China's rise in Asia. And even going back to the first Trump administration, Prime Minister Modi had a really good visit to the United States, and there was sort of a budding bromance between him and President Trump in the first administration. Then the Biden administration continued this through military and diplomatic ties, especially through initiatives like the Quad with the US, India, Japan, and Australia. Tristan, this seems crazy on one hand because of how the US has been trying to build the relationship with India. So what do you see in this? Where is this going?
I think the best way to put it is fascinated by this move because it does seem so contrary to the direction of the US-India relationship, particularly as a strategic hedge against China. Exactly as you flagged, President Trump stated unequivocally that these new measures are in punishment for India's purchase of Russian oil, and India has been purchasing incredible amounts of Russian oil to continue to fuel India's economic growth. And also, as you said, the Biden administration raised this and tried to put a wedge between India and Russia. But this was a delicate move that needed to be made with profound diplomacy because, on the one hand, they want to wrestle India away from Chinese oil, but on the other, they really need to keep India on side as being an alternative to China in terms of manufacturing. So this seems to just really stick some dynamite in all the plans and blow them up. Another reason why President Trump may have struck India with these additional tariffs might well have to do with the recent strengthening of the US-Pakistan relationship. During the India-Pakistan conflict in Kashmir earlier this year, President Trump on multiple occasions, perhaps unsurprisingly, took credit for brokering the ceasefire. Meanwhile, this then prompted the Indians to publicly disavow any account of the American president's claims of ownership of the ceasefire. And India has always maintained that Kashmir is an internal issue and continues to reject foreign mediation. But then on the other side of the border, Pakistan nominated President Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize, and the chief of the Pakistani army visited Trump at the White House for a private lunch. So we've got the Indian Prime Minister trying to isolate Pakistan internationally and maintain, to the eyes of the world, the upper hand in that dyad between India and Pakistan. But then we've now got this rapprochement between the Americans and Pakistanis, which sort of, again, just blows all of that up. And then just to add more fuel to the fire, not that there needs to be any, while announcing higher tariffs on India, the American president also teased massive oil exploration as a deal between Pakistan and the U.S. So it really is just upending things entirely. I'd be keen to hear your thoughts, particularly on what this means for what had been the prospect of India as a strategic hedge against China. To me, it just seems to throw all of that out the window.
Yeah, and that's what's really blowing my mind on this move, because on the one hand, the administration for over a year, and especially since they came in, has been downplaying the Russia-Ukraine war. We just want that over. We're not focusing on that. China is the major competitor to the United States. And I feel like with this move that the China hawks and the administration's heads are exploding, because now it's showing that the Russia-Ukraine war is taking precedence over the competition with China, which is something that the administration that's hypocritical to what they've been saying even before the election and things like that. I mean, look at what J.D. Vance has said about Ukraine. And part of me is like, well, is this their way of putting the vice grips on Russia to have them end the war quickly? But this stuff takes time. It's not going to happen that quickly. And are they saying we're going to risk this to end that war quickly so we can have it over with and then really focus on China? But I don't give them that much credit. And then also to risk the relationship with India at this point, it doesn't really make sense. But again, it's just Trump having no real strategy.
Yeah, and it runs counter to what seems to be the American approach to Ukraine this week. If the idea would be to starve Russia financially by cutting off India buying oil, then that's one way to starve the Russian war machine. But we've got this summit apparently happening in Alaska on Friday, and so that doesn't seem to be the play, at least this week. And yeah, it just once again betrays the astounding fact, it seems, that there is no grand strategy here, let alone strategy with respect to any particular countries, or issues.
Yeah, and speaking of China and the China competition, moving further east now to a somewhat related story. Last week, Japan and Australia signed a $6.5 billion deal for Japan to build 11 frigates for the Royal Australian Navy. So this move marks Tokyo's largest defense sale since the end of the country's ban on military exports in 2014. Now, the deal has just been announced and will likely not be finalized until early next year, but the move signals a deepening in military ties between two nations that are increasingly wary of Chinese expansionism, also two very large allies of the United States. The warships are capable of launching long-range missiles to strike submarines and strike surface ships, while also providing air defense, so very usable ships in case of any dust-ups with China. Australia's defense minister claims that the new warships will quadruple the number of air defense missiles that ships could fire. And the warships are highly automated, with the ability to operate with fairly light crews of just 90 sailors compared to 180 on the ships that Australia currently uses. And they've got a range of 10,000 miles versus 6,000. So it's a significant expansion of Australia's maritime defense capabilities and building a counter to China's Navy, which is now, by numbers, the largest Navy in the world. It also comes amid a broader expansion of defense spending worldwide, with European powers in particular looking to wean themselves off U.S. dependence and respond to threats from Russia. So, how significant is this deal in reshaping the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific? Being a historian at heart and by training, what it speaks to me is the further moves of Japan away from their pacifist constitution that goes back to the end of World War II. And that to me is the biggest sign of this, is them seeing the need to wade back into those waters because of the threat of China. What do you see in this?
Yeah, in and of itself, is it going to change the balance of power in the region? No. But it definitely is another step towards reimagining what Japan's role in security is, particularly in the region. I remember being in Hiroshima for the G7 summit. I guess that was the year before last. And a big theme that wasn't on the agenda, but sort of came up on the margins time and time again, was this assertion of Japan as the new security guarantor, or at least a major security actor is probably more accurate, in the region. Most illustratively, when the British Prime Minister arrived, who was Prime Minister that month? I guess it was Rishi Sunak that month. When he arrived, his first visit was to Japan's aircraft carrier, which of course we can't call an aircraft carrier, but a boat that can take ships, shall we say. So yeah, this to me signals it's the next move. This is Tokyo's largest defense sale since lifting the decades-long ban on military exports, which happened in 2014. And it really is just a continuation of Japan's pivot towards becoming this more active security partner in the region as a counter to China's growing naval supremacy. Now, of course, I think we should absolutely note that arms exports remain politically sensitive in Japan. The government only allows weapons exports to countries not presently involved in a conflict. And Japan's domestic arms suppliers are also dealing with a large influx of orders from the Japanese government itself, which is increasing defense spending to 2% of GDP by 2027. So the defense sector in Japan not only has to deal with the rapid increase of supplying the Japanese government, but also now building Australia's frigates, and then also dealing with overseas defense maintenance and services and supply chain management and all that. So it's a massive and rapid expansion. And now, thinking of this for Australia, this purchase fits into a major military restructuring that was announced by them in 2023, aimed at expanding its fleet from 11 to 26 major warships over the next 10 years. The ships are specifically designed to defend Australia's northern approaches in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, where indeed China's military footprint is rapidly expanding. And this is very much part of Australia's plan to increase their own defense spending from 2 to 2.4% of their GDP. And then the final thing that I want to raise on this is it certainly strengthens the informal alliance network that is designed to counter China without relying solely on US leadership. Both countries, it seems to me, are sending a very clear signal to Beijing that they are willing to solidify their alliance and take more responsibility for regional security, particularly when US military guarantees certainly seem less reliable than ever before.
Yeah, and I think that's especially so when you put this in context of the AUKUS agreement between Australia, the US, and the UK from a few years ago. And it'll be interesting to see what the domestic, I don't want to say backlash, but what the domestic conversation in Australia is like, because I know they've already been getting some pushback on the huge bill that AUKUS requires, which is building submarines and buying submarines and building bases and all that kind of stuff that goes with it. But now on top of that, this other new $6.5 billion deal. So we'll see how that plays out. But I think it speaks to, like you said, this larger signaling to China that it's not just the US. And what I find very interesting in the case of Japan, but also even more so, I guess, in the case of Australia, is that it demonstrates that over the past, I guess, probably decade now, the the efforts by Beijing to separate out individual countries from their alliance and relationship with the US through information operations and political actions, economic actions, and embargoes and things like that hasn't worked.
Yeah.
And more than anything, it's actually done the opposite and shown these countries the threat that China is to them and had them double down on securing the Pacific and even being able to do more on their own, let alone together. So, yeah, interesting moves.
Absolutely.
So that ends our news roundup. We now move to our conversation with Sophal Ear. I'm now thrilled to be joined by Dr. Sophal Ear. Dr. Ear is a tenured associate professor at Arizona State University's Thunderbird School of Global Management, where he teaches global political economy, international organizations, and regional management in Asia. His global experience includes consulting for the World Bank and Asian Development Bank, serving with the UNDP in East Timor, and holding leadership roles with Leopard Capital, the Nathan Cummings Foundation, SEARAC, and the Southeast Asia Development Program. He is the author of Viral Sovereignty and the Political Economy of Pandemics and Aid Dependence in Cambodia, and co-author of The Hungry Dragon. A graduate of Princeton and Berkeley, Dr. Ear came to the U.S. as a Cambodian refugee from France at age 10. Let's listen into the conversation. All right, everyone, welcome back to this episode of Headlines in History, and I'm excited to be joined today from Arizona State University, Dr. Sophal Ear, to talk to us about the recent clashes between Thailand and Cambodia. Sophal, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So I think the first place to start here, because there is a lot of historical baggage and background to this issue and is arguably the main driver of this conflict and ones like it in the past. So can you give us a little bit of the historical roots of this border dispute? I know there's some religious sites involved in it. And where did this begin and why is it still going on?
Right. Well, it goes back over a century, to the Franco-Siamese treaties of 1904 and 1907, when colonial powers drew boundaries with maps that didn't always match ground reality.
Right.
You know, the most famous of this is this French-produced Annex 1 map, which placed the President Bukele temple on the Cambodian side. And the International Court of Justice in 1962 ruled that the temple belongs to Cambodia and reaffirmed that in 2013. But there's a problem. While the temples have been ruled on, large stretches of the 817-kilometer border remain undemarcated. That leaves space for recurring disputes, especially in politically tense moments like these. So there's this political layer, the Hun family that's ruled Cambodia for 40 plus years, and the Shinawatra family in Thailand have decades of warm relations. So there's, Hun Sen and Thaksin were god brothers, literally. They called each other god brothers. But then domestic politics can override personal bonds very quickly. And so we've seen this. These temples are symbolic flashpoints, but the real driver now is contemporary politics, nationalist mobilization, internal military-civil tensions, especially in Thailand, and elite rivalry.
To speak directly to the temples, they're claimed by both sides for religious purposes, correct? So that's where the temple comes into this.
Yeah, I think what it is that everybody understands that these are Khmer temples from the Khmer Empire, which held the territory of modern-day Thailand and southern Vietnam. So there's an empire that has shrunk to the point where now the demarcation is around these borders. And one of the flashpoints was the use of one of these temples for a religious purpose. And it kind of was like seen as, why are you doing this on land that we agreed would be co-managed or would not necessarily be yours to do this on? So it was seen as a trigger of sorts.
Yeah, and these are, we should also note, 900-year-old temples too. So moving to today, you mentioned there's, on the surface, warm relations, but then there's also the domestic politics at play in both countries. So what happened in last month in July to cause the outbreak of hostilities, and why did it escalate so rapidly?
So on May 28th, a Cambodian soldier was shot and died. And so that's the first thing that happened. Of course, accidents happen on borders, but they don't usually lead to a 5-day war. And so what happened next after the death of that soldier was, I would say the immediate trigger was the leak of a private phone call between Thai Prime Minister Pantongtan Shinawatra and former Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen, who is now the Senate president. She tried reaching out to him to cool things down. She didn't get a hold of him. He called her on her private cell and then proceeded to record the call surreptitiously. Recording phone calls, very standard, I would think, for people just to cover their bases, but then to release the call,
Yeah.
it was kind of like, whoa, it's crazy. Now, in the call, she referred to him warmly as
Right.
uncle, made disparaging remarks about her own generals. And in Bangkok, this was read as undermining Thai sovereignty. Because again, like she's the daughter of Thaksin Shinawatra, who is seen as god brother with Hun Sen. And so it's like, what's going on? Our interests, our Thailand's interests being undermined by a prime minister who doesn't understand loyalty here.
Yeah, by this personal relationship.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
that leak ruptured personal trust, gave the Thai military a pretext to act and act hard. Clashes broke out on July 24th near Prasat Damoan Temple, then spread to multiple fronts with artillery, tanks, and even airstrikes. So you've got this trigger that's kind of unprecedented in that, who leaks, first of all? I mean, of course, okay, so Hun Sen said he recorded the call and he sent it to 80 people. And somebody among the 80 leaked 9 minutes of the 17-minute call. And then he then released the whole call and said, for full transparency, here it is. All 17 minutes of it. And there's rumors that maybe it was a Thai military that initially leaked the 9 minutes. Nobody knows who leaked the 9 minutes originally. So maybe, plausibly, I don't know. But he did choose to then get the whole 17 minutes out so that he could say, I'm not hiding anything. Here it is. And I think it was his kind of move to undermine her, obviously, because he felt that somehow her being already very deferential to him was not enough.
Yeah, it seems odd, but yeah.
It's just crazy. Thankfully, it only lasted 5 days, the fighting, 40 casualties across both sides, hundreds of thousands displaced. But there's talk of 18 soldiers 18 Cambodian soldiers still being detained by the Thais. There's talk about 3,000 Cambodian military casualties, which is orders of magnitude higher than what's being officially acknowledged, right?
Yeah, that would be a much bigger deal.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, the Thai side is saying to the Cambodian side, please come and get your dead soldiers. Have some respect for your own soldiers here. They need a proper burial. And, it's a public health hazard to have all these bodies here. It's really not good. And what is going on that a country is not actually picking up its own casualties for proper burial?
Right after a ceasefire has been declared. And you mentioned that the fighting only lasted 5 days. Why was there such a rapid de-escalation and a ceasefire agreement? And what does the ceasefire agreement hold? And to your point about numbers may be larger than we think, and some may still be held, some prisoners. What do you think the likelihood of this ceasefire lasting for some amount of time, at least, are at the moment?
Well, 3 reasons for the ceasefire coming about within those 5 days. First of all, economic pressure. Both countries were days from facing steep U.S. tariffs. So Trump got involved and called the prime ministers of each country, and then the interim prime minister in the case of Thailand, and then posted on Truth Social about these calls, saying that they've agreed to a ceasefire. Secondly, mediation by the Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim as ASEAN chair. He convened talks in Malaysia. And then there was great power convergence. Both the U.S. and China wanted stability, albeit for different reasons. China officially was an observer of the peace talks or the ceasefire talks in Malaysia. The U.S. was a co-organizer. And you can see from the speeches of the prime ministers of Thailand and Cambodia that they acknowledged Trump's actions and the U.S. support in all of this. So in a way, this wasn't a 5-day war because the root issues were resolved. Not at all. It was because both sides decided they had more to lose than gain by dragging it out.
Right. So the longer term issues definitely not gone. I want to unpack a couple of things you said there with a couple more questions before we get you out of here. So You mentioned both the US and China having somewhat of a role in the talks. So where does the Thailand-Cambodia relationship fall in the bigger picture of the US-China geopolitical challenge?
I think it could be seen as a kind of proxy situation. The US is a treaty alliance partner with Thailand, and China has been a patron of Cambodia for some time now. It could be seen as, okay, one side is closer to China, very close to China, and one side is closer to the US, although Thailand is cozying up to China
Yeah.
other ways, economically, obviously militarily. They used F-16s to attack Cambodia, so those are US planes, but the new planes they've bought, Gripens, are Swedish Saab ones, so it's clear that they're going to buy elsewhere and not the US. So I think that relationship is very much one of, okay, maybe if one were still in a Cold War mentality or that type of thinking, it would be that these are proxies for future chessboards.
Yeah, but it's a much more conflicted and confusing time than a bipolar Cold War mentalities. And then lastly, you also mentioned ASEAN. So what role, if any, can they play in this, in trying to tamp down future conflict?
Well, ASEAN, of course, is an alliance or a association of these 10 member states of Southeast Asia that is supposed to foremost keep the peace in terms of good relations and so on. And the failure of ASEAN in making sure that two of its members, Thailand and Cambodia, didn't fight is apparent. I mean, I think the foreign minister of Singapore said, you can't put lipstick on this. It's obvious what happened. We've lost credibility as a result. ASEAN, I think, is problematic in that the way that it operates, it works by consensus. So it already poses a problem when one member out of 10 says they don't agree with what's going on. Nothing passes as a result. So that's problematic. But it's just that there hasn't been a kind of mechanism to deal with a problem that obviously has been recurring and has been going on for over a century, right? I mean, it's older than ASEAN's creation itself. But even in this context, you would hope that ASEAN could build mechanisms that would help to facilitate the prevention of such future conflicts. But I don't know. Will Cambodia and Thailand accept peacekeepers, observers from ASEAN countries, for example? So far, they haven't said that they would. And so the role for ASEAN continues to be limited. And Malaysia has said, we're happy to step in and have observers so that confidence building measures can continue to grow, right? And that's critical. But if both sides aren't saying, yeah, come on in, let's have third parties in here, then it won't work. Thailand traditionally has been very bilaterally focused in resolving this. They want to just deal with Cambodia directly, don't involve the International Court of Justice, don't involve the International Criminal Court and claiming war crimes or whatnot that Cambodia has said that Thailand committed. But obviously, that's not what Cambodia wants because Cambodia is a smaller neighbor and can't really, on its own, balance out Thailand.
Yeah, so it doesn't seem in the short term or near term that there's going to be a long-term solution to this. So something we'll keep an eye on. And you mentioned the role that the US played and Donald Trump supposedly calling both of the prime ministers and the one interim prime minister. But was that kind of it? Was that sort of just a phone call, talked about the tariffs and basically saying, stop this and moving on? The US isn't going to pony up observers for this.
No, I don't think it will. But it's fascinating. I mean, the timing worked in this case. You're negotiating right now with the US, so we're not going to talk anymore until you stop fighting each other. And so that got the attention of Thailand and Cambodia. I mean, the US tariff negotiations and Trump's outreach came before Cambodia floated this latest thing that it wants to do for Trump, which is this Nobel Prize nomination, Peace Prize nomination to curry more favor, I suppose. But it's really a one-off situation, right? Right afterwards, the tariffs were announced. They're 19%, which for Cambodia, starting out at 49%, then to 36, then to 19 is good. Not great because tariffs are just not good for trade.
Still 19%, yeah.
Yeah. And for Thailand, it was also 19%. So he treated both with the same tariff levels. but that's a very blunt instrument. I mean, how many times can you just keep scaring countries with tariffs and saying, we're just going to do this to you every time you don't do what we want? It's not a credible strategy of any kind, long-term wise, sustainable in any way. So I don't think this is going to mean that the U.S. is going to be more deeply engaged going forward per se. It just means, yes, it got lucky this time with using this.
All right, Sophal, thank you very much for the background information and making us a little bit smarter on Cambodia and Thailand.
You're very welcome. Thanks.
Thank you again to Dr. Ear for his time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines in History. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GeoDiplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.